Hello, this is a Shakespeare comedy video lecture that will be useful for your revision of the Tempest. I'm going to go through the conventions of Shakespeare comedy in general, so it's useful for AO2, language, form and structure, but it's also useful for AO4, literary context. So hopefully you'll find some useful things here. While the comedies and tragedies share many conventions or many similar ingredients, we can tell from their names alone that they are different in their outlook. Tragedies, by their nature, concentrate on individual characters, and for them to be tragedy, we've got to become very engaged with those characters, and Shakespeare gives us an in-depth analysis of the characters, and that's why the plays are named after individuals. Whereas the comedies, are more about issues or attitudes to life, as you like it, or about actions. So the comedies have a slightly different slant in that they are more a close analysis of an attitude or a way of thinking about things. In the comedies, we don't become too involved or too caught up with individual characters. We keep aloof of the drama, and so there's several plot lines working at once, and so we have to have a distance with the characters in order for us to laugh at them and with them. For this reason, there will be a lot more dramatic irony in the comedies than, say, in the tragedies, although it will still exist in the tragedies. So what are the conventions of comedy? I'm not going to read all of this. You can pause the video and read these at your leisure, but certainly the plays will be about love, most of them, and the obstacles that young lovers have to face in order to find love and have a harmonious union, usually in marriage. And so the drama is really about that. Drama is all about conflict, and we have to have this kind of conflict in order to have the drama. But comedies are usually resolved harmoniously. They may involve fantastic or improbable events, so often the use of magic or the supernatural, fairy kingdoms. And within the comedy, there will be a willful disregard of the social order in many ways. So we get lots of transformations in which the rules of society are broken, but only temporarily. With the best of the comedies, we have a philosophical aspect that sometimes they deal with serious issues as well within the comedy, the importance of love or identity. And you should look out for where the tone of the comedies takes on a sort of philosophical aspect or becomes more serious. Okay, so what typical conventions does Shakespeare use? In the comedies, because drama is, we need to have conflict, he usually sets up the opposition of two sides in Acts 1 and Act 2 who oppose each other. Often that's the old and the young. So often it will be the case that daughters rebel against fathers' wishes. Often fathers want to marry their daughters off to people they approve of, and daughters are not willing to go along with that. Or you might have the opposition between two apparent enemies of opposite sex who eventually fall in love with each other. So the course of love never did run smooth is often a summary of many of Shakespeare's plays, and the opposition is something that is then harmonised at the end. One of the things that the plays do deal with is dramatic irony for the audience. For us to laugh at them, the characters in these plays, we need to have full information about what's going on, particularly in the middle scenes where confusion reigns, usually through transformation, mistaken identity, or plotting or scheming. The audience are fully aware of what's going on at all times, even if the characters are not. And this is where the humour lies, in that we know more than the characters on stage, and as a result we can laugh at their their mistakes and their puzzlement and their confusion. And we're going to look at an example of that here. Okay, in Shakespeare's comedies, we often find recognisable types that reoccur in many of the plays. So, for instance, we often get the love-struck young man who can be love-struck through magical forces, people putting love potions on his eyes, or love potion going on the wrong eyes, such as in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Or we could have victims of mistaken identity, implausible plots where twins separated at birth meet up again, or are shipwrecked on an island where they're reunited, but before they're reunited, one's mistaken for the other, and it's usually involving love and confusion. What seems to be quite interesting in Shakespeare's comedies is the absence of mothers. You might want to read about this on the e-magazine articles that are on Woodle. But one reason for this is that often, because the drama involves fathers and daughters, if mothers were there, they would probably bring about some solutions. They would soften the father's attitude to the daughters, or they would, with their daughters, advise how they would overcome problems. So Shakespeare deliberately leaves mothers absent so that creates confusion and conflict, which makes for good drama. One of the things we're going to look at now is a typical example of the angry father blocking the will of the daughter. This is the start of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and what we have here is Aegeus, or Aegeus, never quite know how to pronounce it, Hermia's father, who's appealing to the king, I think it's the king or the duke of Athens, for his daughter. Essentially, he wants his daughter, Hermia, to marry a man of his choosing, Demetrius. Remember, one of the contexts of this time is that marriage is seen as an alliance of families, and not necessarily that it wasn't necessary that people married out of love. So often one of the conflicts that we start with in these plays is the idea that fathers want to marry off their daughter to someone to make an alliance. However, Hermia is in love with Lysander, and Aegeus isn't happy about this. He thinks that Lysander's bewitched the bosom of his child. He's given her rhymes and interchanged love tokens. And this is almost the mirror image of Desdemona's father in the tragedy Othello, who believes that Desdemona has been bewitched by the African Moor. So comedies and tragedies often start the same way. They just end differently. What we have here is that the subject of obedience comes up. Aegeus, as a father, thinks that he should have the obedience of his daughter, that she is his property to do with what he wants. And if he doesn't get it, he's prepared to have his daughter killed, rather like sort of an honour killing that unfortunately we hear about, even today. So there's in comedies the potential for tragedy, and that's the way it works out in Othello. And here the drama often comes with a very serious rule at the beginning. The drama is initiated by a harsh rule that leads to conflict. What we also notice here is Aegeus is speaking in verse. It's iambic pentameter, to signify that he's a nobleman and of the court. The aristocrats speak in verse, and the low characters will speak in prose. I'll talk further about that later on. Okay, this is Act 1, Scene 1 of Much Ado About Nothing. We start off with two characters who hate each other. Benedict and Beatrice can't stand each other, which in Shakespeare's comedies is always a sign that they're going to end up getting off with each other at the end. Now here they're speaking in prose. And you can probably tell it's prose because visually on a page, it looks like it just looks like words in a book, rather than a stanza of poetry. Prose is everyday language, and so it won't have a regular rhythm of 10 iambics of iambic pentameter. It might be stripped of a lot of the poetic devices like imagery, simile, and personification. But we can still see what Shakespeare's doing with the prose here. And the language, as Frank Commode says, is the life of the play is often in the language itself. So let's look at this. Shakespeare shows us that these characters, even though they hate each other, tend to be finishing off each other's sentences. So for instance, when Beatrice talks about courtesy, here we see Benedict respond, and so this carries on all the way through. You have a scratched face. Scratching could not make it worse. You're a parrot teacher. A bird of my tongue is better than a beast of yours. So these people these two so-called enemies are given a kind of witty prose backwards and forwards, but it's evenly matched, and perhaps the language is showing that they're listening to everything each other says, and they often finish each other's sentences or respond with a witty repartee. And so the language in prose here is also signalling the how equally matched and perhaps well matched these characters are. So to recap, prose is everyday language. It won't have a regular rhythm or meter. It's unlikely to have lots of imagery, simile, and personification and poetic techniques. Prose is usually spoken in the plays by the low characters, the servants and the lower class workers, but not necessarily always, because often some of the aristocratic characters or the main characters may well shift from verse to prose, and this may signal or indicate a change in emotional state, like we've seen in the last example. If we return to these lovers, obviously at the end of the play, we find that again they're speaking in prose, but this time the prose is marked by its simplicity, and perhaps the simplicity is showing the honesty of their affections. If they were speaking in prose at this time, if they were speaking in verse, it might seem perhaps a little artificial for this moment of recognition that they both love each other and can't believe that the other person loves them. So it's marked by ellipsis, their lines are fading out, and simplicity of language that is probably a hallmark of their sincerity of their feelings. And maybe this can be compared, if you like, with, let me see how I can do this, with two more lovers. This time, forgive me for jumping between plays, but this time we're back to A Midsummer Night's Dream, which you might be familiar with. And if we compare the language in this section, Lysander and Hermia are talking in alternate rhyming lines. So we've got wood rhyming with good, and way rhyming with day. And be it so, Lysander, find you out of bed, for I upon this bank will rest my head. Sounds very pantomimey, if you like. It sounds quite immature. And maybe the audience are not taking this all very seriously at this moment. It's rather like quite childlike. And perhaps the language is kind of heralding the fact that they're now going to enter into a magical kingdom. And again, magic is often signified by heavy use of rhyme to suggest its otherworldly character. So we're perhaps invited here through the language of the heavy use of rhyme to sort of not take this too seriously, and be prepared to laugh at the goings on that go on in the woods. Okay, here's an exchange between Oberon and Titania from Midsummer Night's Dream, and what we see in this section is one of the main conventions of comedy is the idea of transformations and individual characters being transformed into something else. This allows the audience a great deal of laughter because lots of confusion sort of arises from transformations, and we laugh at the confusion. So some of the examples of transformations will be characters being transformed magically into animals, like Bottom being transformed into an ass, or magic spells being put onto people so that they fall in love with inappropriate characters. Other characters are not transformed, but we have the use of mistaken identity. So the way people around them behave transforms because they mistake them for somebody else. And the comedy arising from that. Okay, so let's take a look at an example of transformation. This time it's from Measure for Measure, which is technically a comedy, but it's also called a problem play because the themes and the events of the play are so serious that it's very hard to sort of put it under the title of comedy. Now, Angelo is a judge. He's put in charge of Vienna, and he prides himself on being very strict, very harsh, very severe on himself and his behaviour, and very strict on others who sin. And in this soliloquy, which it is, he's talking to himself, and as we know, soliloquies are in verse. Angelo is really commenting on his own transformation, and he what marks this soliloquy out is the heavy use of punctuation. What am I? What is this? Is it her fault or mine? Typically, he sort of blames the woman for the fact he's tempted by her. Angelo is lusting after a trainee nun who's come to plead for the life of her brother, and he desires her body, and he's never had this before. He's never had this. He's never been transformed in this way, and the verse is kind of marked by a series of metaphors and similes. So he compares this lust to being like the corruption of dead animals in the sunshine. He compares his desires with using the metaphors of, well, it would be like burning down a sanctuary or a convent. And he's kind of disgusted by his own lusts, but in a way he's also questioning his own behaviour. And I want to talk about a few things that mark this out as verse. Most of this will be in 10-syllable lines, giving it a regular rhythm. But because this character is going through some transformation that he doesn't understand, the regular rhythm will be punctuated by breaks. So there's lots of question marks and breaks and hesitations, which suggest, the language is reflecting the transformation of the character. He's thinking, what am I? What am I, Angelo? I wasn't what I thought I was. I'm someone who's as disgusting as other people seem to be. And this makes him question what he's like. And so part of the verse, we see examples of antithesis. Thieves for their robbery have authority when judges steal themselves. So ideas in sentences in which there's two examples, two opposing ideas of thought in the same sentence, maybe reflecting his confusion. And again, lots of metaphors like fish metaphors, bait thy hook. The idea of, what catches him out is the fact that he desires this girl for her purity, and and if we move down to the end, he says, nothing could have tempted him. The common strumpet or prostitute couldn't have tempted him with all her makeup, art, and nature. But this virtuous maid subdues me quite. And it ends on it, even till now, when I was fond, I smiled and wondered how. So he looked at other men and wondered how they could be so stupid, so fond. But now he realises, wow, until I didn't know, I was like that myself. Now, what's quite interesting about this is that he's a Puritan. Puritans wanted to close down the theatres. And so the audience are watching one of their enemies, who would be quite willing to close down the theatres and take away their pleasure, turning out to be just like them. And so this would be an example of transformations being used for comic effect. The audience would laugh at these characters who show themselves to be quite puritanical and yet are just like the theatre goers who have probably gone to visit prostitute or the bear baiting before going to the theatre and indulging in the laughter of sin. So to recap, what is verse again? Verse is usually spoken by the main characters, the protagonists or the aristocratic class, the wealthy, if there's spirits, the kings and queens of the fairy world. These people usually speak in verse. Verse is usually marked by 10-syllable lines, more or less, iambic pentameter. So there's a regular rhythm to the verse. Verse will possess all the poetic techniques you've covered in AS. So, for instance, similes, metaphors, personification, and all the examples of rhetorical techniques, such as the rule of three, hyperbole, classical allusions, personification, I've said, antithesis, rhetorical questions. These are the sort of things. So the language will be quite elaborate, which is the opposite of prose, where it be more everyday language. So now we know a little bit about the typical conventions of Shakespeare's comedies. I'm going to sort of give an overview of how we can see Shakespeare as quite a transgressive writer. What I mean by that is somebody who breaks the rules, somebody who questions the values of his own society and challenges them, transgresses them and challenges them. The opposing view is that Shakespeare isn't in any way a radical, a rebel, but is in fact very conservative, and that his comedies actually reinforce conservative values. They reinforce the contextual values of his day. So I'm going to try and summarise with these pictures that we can see. Let's start with the argument that Shakespeare is quite conservative, and that rather than being a rebel, he's just reinforcing what his society thinks should take place. So let's take the idea of the patriarchal society, particularly fathers in charge of daughters. What we tend to find is that the plays do end in marriage, and some feminist writers would say that the female characters get passed from one patriarchal boss, a father, to a husband, and often marriage silences these quite rebellious daughters. So maybe they're rebellious for the first couple of acts, but usually they are silenced by marriage, because it's common for these plays to end in marriage. And marriage is society's way of showing harmony and unity. Shakespeare usually ends his plays on marriage, and they're a sign of harmony being restored and the natural order being restored. and marriage is a way of signalling that. One of the things that we can talk about, I suppose, is the kind of class structure. Here we've got some boys off to Eton, watched by some working class Cockney boys. Some people would argue that Shakespeare is quite conservative in his nature of class. Only the rich and the aristocratic speak in the beautiful verse. The working class, slaves or servants, are marked by their ordinary prose language. And that while there might be some transformations in these plays, and so upper class characters may well mix with the lower class characters, may well fall in love with them temporarily, such as Titania falling in love with Bottom, an aristocratic fairy queen. These transformations don't last for very long. The spell wears out, order is restored, the classes are separated. And if you notice the marriages in Shakespeare, people marry within their class. They never marry across the classes, as far as I can say. I may be mistaken on that, but I don't think they do. So in many ways we could say that Shakespeare's plays reinforce the moral values of their day. And let's take the opposite side of view, the transgressive argument now. In many ways, Shakespeare's plays are characteristic. What seems to be a characteristic is the idea of the rebellious daughters, or the rebellious females who are not willing to play by the rules of their society. So we have Hermia defying her father and wanting to marry the man that she loves. This is in an age in which marriage was seen as, an alliance between families. But Shakespeare shows us defiant girls who either are not willing to marry at all, as in The Taming of the Shrew, or are determined to pursue their own path and marry who they want. And eventually they bring their fathers round to their way of thinking. From this point of view, marriage can be seen as a reward for the strength of character of these females. And so, the argument is that Shakespeare's showing us vibrant, rebellious daughters who have their own minds. One of the ways in which Shakespeare is quite transgressive is in the use of cross-dressing. Because only boys would be playing the female characters on stage, you've got the kind of physical comedy of men falling in love with young boys, really, and who are dressed as women. And so that in itself is quite transgressive, and it's got a physical element of comedy attached to it. But then Shakespeare mixes it up in many of the plays in which there's cross-dressing, such as in Twelfth Night and As You Like It. Females take on the role of males, and then other men fall in love with these supposedly male characters. So there's lots of homoerotic sort of transgressions going on. Twelfth Night, for instance, is subtitled As You Like It. No, it isn't. What is it? What You Will. Sorry, What You Will. And maybe this is a statement about sexuality, and that sexuality isn't necessarily fixed. And so we've got the level of young boys dressing up as girls, acting in plays pretending to be men, and we've got men falling in love with who they think are men, but are really women acting as men, but really they're boys acting as women, acting as men. So maybe Shakespeare is showing through this laughter that actually, sexuality isn't such a fixed thing at all, and that's quite a transgressive idea, I suppose, for the time. Again, the transformations are quite transgressive. Shakespeare shows us people in power, aristocrats, judges, who, when they get a bit of lust inside them, are transformed, and we see that they're no different to the rest of us. So we have high noble characters like Angelo looked at before, having the same lusts and desires as the lowly characters that he wishes to condemn. And maybe Shakespeare's showing us that, the really self-important characters are hypocritical, and that people who wear a mask of virtue and good reputation, he strips that, and so we see the real self behind the facade and the image that they put up. And the theme of appearance versus reality it seems to be common to all of his plays, and maybe he's exposing human nature for what it is, not necessarily criticising it, but really highlighting the fact that people who wear masks are usually hiding something about themselves, and that really we're not all that different from each other. And that's maybe quite a radical statement to make in an era in which there was a fixed world order in which everyone had their place, and there was a hierarchy in which you were meant to offer obedience to those above you, be it fathers or kings or the class or women giving obedience to men. Shakespeare seems to be questioning that quite a lot. One of the things you're probably aware of in the comedies by now is that it's not all comedy, but that there's serious points to be made about life, and philosophical questions are raised in the comedies, just as in the tragedies there will be a lot of comedy. So let's take a couple of examples of these serious philosophical questions that Shakespeare's raising. Okay, I'm going to return to Measure for Measure again. A play which is strictly a comedy and has absolutely the same structure of comedy as the Tempest, but it's seen as a problem play because it's dealing with quite a lot of serious issues that could involve death, and really it's about law and order, judging others, and how we impose a punishment system in a society. Okay, in this extract, this is the Duke, who's in disguise as a friar, who's come to a prison, and he's supposed to be giving spiritual counsel to Claudio, who's condemned to die the next day. And so he should be fitting his soul for death, should be praying with him, and should be talking about the afterlife and heaven, and comforting his soul in some way, getting ready for being hung. But what we find interesting about this speech is the absence of religion in many ways. He's persuading him that not to fear death, and he's arguing about, well, what's the opposite? What does life give us? What are we in life? But we breathe, and we're servile to all the sky influences. We're at the mercy of anything that life throws at us, and that hourly afflict us. So he starts to see life. The Duke is talking about life as some kind of affliction or sickness, and that to avoid death, we're just fools, because the further we run from it, we run towards it, and so death is something that is going to catch up with us anyway. And he says to run away from death is by no means valiant. It's not a brave thing. So what is there to fear, really, but the soft and tender fork of a poor worm? And that death is nothing to fear, but because it's just asleep. Which is, it's quite interesting. But what is interesting about this, and this man is dressed up as a friar, a religious man, is that there is an absence of religion in contemplating death. Shakespeare often talks about death as like a sleep, and I think that often when talking about the afterlife, there's an absence of religion in Shakespeare, even if there's lots of religious references in other extracts. So this is quite a serious philosophical aspect to take in a comedy, this idea, this notions of what comes afterwards, what is death. Let's compare that previous speech with Prospero's speech in Act 4 of The Tempest. Again, Prospero is just put on a great fairy display for the lovers, for his daughter Miranda and Ferdinand, and he's conjured up the magic of these gods meeting and celebrating the union of their love. And as this fades away, it makes Prospero think about life in some sense. Let's have a look at that. Okay, so we again, it's in verse. It's the protagonist. The powerful figure of Prospero is signified by the use of verse. But this is an old man reaching towards the end of his life, and here we start to see, as the show that he's put on starts to fade away, he starts to compare these actors and spirits melting into the air with life itself. So this baseless fabric of this vision that he's created, these cloud-capped towers, this magical creation that he's created, is like the world itself, and our lives. We shall dissolve, and just like this insubstantial pageant, we shall fade, and leaving nothing behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. So again, we've got that idea of death being like a sleep, and the idea of life being something quite insubstantial, a work of the imagination. Again, you might see echoes of previous Shakespeare plays talking about life as like a performance on a stage, and we are merely players upon it. And so maybe this is philosophical questions about life that we're all playing a part, and it's not very substantial, and it will fade, and then we will return to sleep. Again, it's interesting that it seems to be a kind of absence of spirituality or heaven or God in these philosophical musings. And it's interesting also that Shakespeare seems to return to the same idea of life being like actors on a stage, and insubstantial, and that death is nothing but a sleep. So these comedies are equally as serious as the tragedies in what they have to say about life and the nature of life and the afterlife. Okay, so you may wish to think about the play that you're exploring, The Tempest, and other plays if you're doing coursework on Shakespeare, and what themes and questions are raised by your particular comedy. Some of the common ones are, I suppose, the representation of women in this play. How are women coming across? And plays which involve men and women, perhaps. What is the play saying about sexual morality, sexual behaviour? Is it sort of ridiculing hypocrisy? Is it saying that we're all the same anyway? So consider that. Many of the comedies and all of the plays in some way acknowledge a society based on fixed hierarchies. What is your play saying about power and justice and vengeance? Are the characters behaving in a fair way? Is Shakespeare questioning notions of power and this fixed society? Are people undergoing transformations which make us laugh at them, but make us also question the idea of somebody perpetually being in charge of others? I talked about the idea of learning to acquire self-knowledge, and maybe knowledge comes from transformations in some ways. So what do the characters learn from being transformed? That's something maybe to consider. What do they learn from their own mistakes? And at the end of the play, where there's restoration and harmony, what has been learned? Have they learned to overcome differences? Have they learned from each other, perhaps? From all the comic confusion, what has come out of it? Because we started this long presentation by talking about the nature of love, what does Shakespeare have to say about the nature of love? And perhaps the nature of identity? be it male or female, or about the identity of a lover, and gender. So consider these things in relation to your work on the Tempest. This is the comedy structure in 5 acts. This is very similar to the comedy structure of tragedies. The same things more or less happen at the same times. This is Acts 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 if you can't see them. And it follows, in many ways the structure of tragedies, except the final climax at the end. Instead of tragedy and death, we have understanding, restoration, confusion is solved, and people's true identities are revealed. People have overcome their differences, and they're rewarded with marriage at the end, and celebration. And marriage is seen as a symbol of the restoration of order and union, and that everything is okay. What's also interesting, though, is the idea of there's not always such a neat ending. Yes, everyone finishes with a marriage, and it seems to be okay, but there's always that kind of outsider character, someone like Angelo, who doesn't really fit into the schemes of things. Angelo, Measure for Measure, I should say, or Malvolio. Characters who are condemned to be outsiders and not a part of the party. They're perpetually left outside, and perhaps the audience are made to... this is what gives the comedies their serious tone, is maybe we're meant to question some of the resolutions and some of the restoration. Is it always entirely fair? And so try to look at the end of the plays in the restoration of order. How much is there a restoration? Or are some characters left out of that? For instance, Caliban. He's kind of left out of the celebrations at the end, and maybe the audience are left with lingering doubts about some of the questions raised in the play. So, in conclusion, climax, restoration, order, symbolised by marriage, but with some kind of nagging doubts about the final solutions. Okay, finally back to the Tempest. If we talked about these nagging doubts make us question some of the themes that come up, and maybe we're asked to think about, particularly with the idea of Caliban, who's no better off at the end than he was at the beginning. We're maybe meant to question and think about some of these themes in terms of the play as a whole. And I leave you to think about those yourself, and what your position is on this play.